Welcome, everyone, to this week's episode of Freedom Hub Working Group. I'm your host, Jeff Cantor, along with my co-host, Charles Froman. We're excited to have you be here today. It's going to be another interesting episode, to be sure. We did want you to know that this is all going to be recorded, so you'll be able to register to see these in the future, and please share this with others to come and attend these as they are live. And then, as you can see, these are all case sensitive, but these are the links. We're on some of the more popular channels. And also, we're totally sponsored by yourfreedomhub.com. So if you're interested in finding about how to try to be part of this whole disruptive activity in America, that's the place to go. So on that note, let me show you for a quick minute here. We do maintain a LinkedIn page, so you're certainly welcome to participate in that. Always a fun place to be. We are, as I said, sponsored by the Hub, and here are where those videos live. And you'll see there's a wealth of them out there. Some of these go back for well over a year, and there's some spectacular guests on here, from what really happened on 9/11 to what are they doing in our geoengineering of weather, and a lot of other interesting topics, as well as on YouTube. But today we have another interesting guest, as I said, so please let's have Charles give us a good rundown on what we've got in store for us.
Indeed, Jeff. And Jeff Deist, welcome. I've known Jeff since the 2000s, when he was chief of staff to Congressman Ron Paul. He had come on board, I think, from a long career as an attorney, mostly in the tax compliance and defense space. Since the congressman's retirement, Jeff has moved over to the eminent Mises Institute, where he is the president. And when we discussed what Jeff would discuss today, he thought we should talk about the small revolution, the revolution of decentralization and devolution from the federal government to the state governments and even to local government, especially apropos as we worry and struggle with this coronavirus, which seems to lead a lot of folks to just blindly trust Big Brother to solve it, and let's just centralize everything and let them take care of it. So it could be a tougher audience in the general public for this small revolution idea. But if anyone can lay the case, I'm sure Jeff can do it. So that's our preview, Jeff.
Well, it's interesting, Charlie, that you know, when you and I discussed the topic, this coronavirus thing was not nearly as newsworthy or as imminent as it is today. And as you mentioned, there's sort of two conclusions you can draw from this, from a pandemic. One is that because the world has gotten smaller, thanks to global trade and global travel, one might make the argument for international government or supranational government to deal with crises like this, to say, well, gee whiz, because we're all so interconnected now, including even our intimate health is interconnected with people thousands of miles away in China, for example. We ought to have bigger government to help us coordinate and solve this sort of thing. The other argument I would say is that a pandemic like the coronavirus actually makes the case for localism, because at the end of the day, whatever health care you and I might require is going to be very, very localized. It's going to be provided at a hyper-local level. That's going to depend on, let's say, the intensive care beds available in your town or your suburb or your city. It's going to depend upon the antiviral or antibiotic drugs or whatever it might be available at the local pharmacy closest to you. So, you know, it's interesting that they say there's no atheists in foxholes, and now some of our friends are making the joke that there are no libertarians in a pandemic. I'm not entirely convinced, and I'd like to sort of jump from that to this overall topic for today, which is the decentralized case for smaller government, the small revolution, because I think that big is over. I think big is done. I think big is failing. And I think big is a very tough sell and will be a tougher sell in the years to come. So let me explain what I mean by that. Not too long ago, I think in 2018, there was some polling. So let me explain about what I mean by the small revolution. What I mean is that I think big is over. I think big is done. I think big is going to be an increasingly tough sell in the years to come. And let me give you some context behind this. Not too long ago, I believe in 2018, there was some polling done in the former Soviet Union, now Russia and its various breakaway republics. And basically, the result of this polling was that over 50% of Russians had favorable views of Joseph Stalin. I'm talking about in 2018, not in 1955 or something. In 2018, still more than half of Russians have favorable views of Joseph Stalin generally, and in particular, more than 70% of Russians viewed him positively in terms of a modernizer and a reformer. I mean, Joseph Stalin's the guy who helped Russia win World War II. So in a sense, against all odds, against everything we know about history, against everything we know about the 20th century and the pile of bodies that resulted from the Russian Revolution, there are still people who view Joseph Stalin favorably. And what does that mean for the context of our conversation today? Well, it means that people don't much change their minds, even when facts and evidence pile up against them. So here's this great few lines from an old epic poem. Some of you might have suffered through Beowulf in high school or college. Well, this is an epic poem by Samuel Butler in the 17th century that's somewhat akin to Beowulf in length, but it's a satirical poem. It's a poem that Samuel Butler wrote to skewer the puritanical rule of England at the time, the Church of England. So he has these lines here that said, he that complies against his will is of his own opinion still. And some people with us today might fast forward a couple hundred years and recall the famous self-help book. It's getting kind of dated now, but the famous self-help book written by Dale Carnegie called How to Win Friends and Influence People. Well, one of the chapters in that book is called The Man Who Complies Against His Will is of the same opinion still. So what Dale Carnegie meant by that is you don't win an argument. No matter how many great libertarian arguments we throw at the world, no matter how much the history of the 20th century would seem to argue against socialism and collectivism of whatever variant, Chinese, Russian, Hitler, whatever it might be, people still believe the same things about collectivism. We're having a hard time winning them over. And so if we think about that, the question becomes, is our job or is our goal to persuade, let's say, 51% of the electorate in some area, let's say United States in a national election, to come around to our view? Is that our job? Is that our goal? Maybe, and I'm all for that. I'm all for a multi-pronged approach to a freer society. But let's say we wanted to get a somewhat libertarian-ish president elected nationally in this country. Well, that requires about 65 to 70 million votes. That's a pretty big enchilada. And not only that, it requires about $1 billion to run a competent presidential campaign at this point in America. So $1 billion and 65 million votes, there are maybe at most 5 to 10 people in the entire country with the name ID and the wherewithal to raise that kind of money and garner that many votes. So that's very, very tough. There's a PBS Frontline documentary series going on right now called Divided America. And I understand that this is a little overused, becoming a little trite that we're so divided in this country. But nonetheless, I think it's true. And they recently had a 2-part interview with Steve Bannon. Bannon was infamously one of the advisors to the Trump 2016 campaign. And so Steve Bannon said, well, we're in post-persuasion America. What he means by that is that we all have, a little cell phone the size of a deck of cards in our pockets. We all have virtually free and instantaneous access to information. If any of us wants to read about libertarianism or socialism or Austrian economics or the coronavirus or any other topic, the cost to us for doing so has never been smaller in terms of our time. I mean, we literally have information at our fingertips. And what Bannon meant when he said we're in post-persuasion America is that people have sort of made up their minds. It's getting actually harder because of the digital information age to change people's minds and persuade them, not easier. So I'm not sure that that's true, but it sounds plausible to me, is that there's so much white noise out there that even though we're making strides as libertarians, there's more of us than ever before. We can communicate with each other and spread ideas easier and cheaper and faster than we ever could before. We can just press a button and send digital content to anyone on Earth who has an internet connection. You'd think these are all things that argue in our favor of persuading, let's say, America or the West to become more libertarian. But the flip side of that is that everybody else has the ability to do that too. And there's so much white noise out there to cut through that maybe even though libertarianism is growing, or libertarian-minded people are increasing on a per capita level, maybe we're not. Maybe the general population is growing faster than when the Libertarian Party was created. For instance, in the early 70s, the US population was 250 million people. Now it's 320. So even if we've added 5 or 10 million libertarians since then, maybe we're worse off per capita. So my point is that when we think big, when we think of winning over 51% of the electorate in a country like the United States, it's very, very tough. So when we think about what I alluded to earlier, which is the political divide in America and trying to win, we have this sense that democracy yields some sort of compromise. And of course, we have mass democracy in America, not localized democracy. We have national elections, which decide, unfortunately, way too much, because the US federal government has way too much power, far more than it was meant to have constitutionally. And also because presidents, with the help of some legal scholars, have pushed this idea of the unitary executive. So not only is the federal government too powerful, but within the federal government, the executive is far too powerful, vis-a-vis the other two supposed branches of government. So executives have corralled more and more federal power over the 20th century and now into the 21st. So unfortunately, it really matters who is president. And so that ought to trouble us. But nonetheless, we have 320 million people in this country. Maybe a little more than half of them are eligible to vote. They go out and vote in these national elections, these vast elections. And what we like to think is that, well, there's this far left and far right, and they both have crazy ideas on the fringe, but they don't really win. And the candidates who do win are more down the middle, and they represent a compromise. So we get rid of some of the worst excesses of the far left and the far right, and we strike some sort of compromise down the middle, whereby neither side gets everything it wants, but both sides get some of what they want. That's sort of the idea. That's sort of the kindergarten version of democracy that we still have in our heads sometimes, but that's not the reality at all. No, nobody's happy. The left isn't happy in this country. The right isn't happy. Nobody thinks they're getting a reasonable compromise. All that's happening with the federalization of everything and mass voting is the creation of an endless bureaucratic state that becomes more and more entrenched, that doesn't come and go when new people are elected to federal office, when new presidents are elected. It just grows and becomes sort of a government unto itself. Now, you can call that the deep state. You can just call that bureaucratic mission creep. You can call that whatever you want. But nonetheless, it creates a situation where, people in America are not happy. They feel vanquished politically. They feel like they have no say. And that's true. I mean, that happens to be true. The average person in America has very little say about the rules by which he or she is going to be expected to live, per government. So there's this great quote from Ludwig von Mises, which is on your screen, about having to belong to a state to which you don't wish to belong. And it's no less onerous because it happens through an election than if it was by a military conquest, that you were actually occupied by an invading military force. Now, war analogies are not something we should take lightly. We use them in sports. We use them in all kinds of contexts. But I just want to add, Ludwig von Mises was an artillery officer in what they then called the Great War, World War I. He was in his late 20s, and he fought on the side of the Austro-Hungarian army and saw some very, very dark moments during that war. And he alludes to them in his memoirs. And because of what he saw, the carnage and the horrific situation in the Great War, World War I, he decided then and there that if he survived and when the war ended, that he would write about this and make the case for what those of us here today would consider a truly liberal society. And he did make that case in both his books, Socialism in the early 1920s and then Liberalism in the late 1920s, two books he wrote in the interwar period after returning from World War I. So this idea that having to belong to a state that's governed by forces you feel are opposed to you really makes you feel vanquished. You feel politically vanquished. And there are millions upon millions of Hillary Clinton supporters in this country right now who feel like they're living in an occupied state. They feel like they've been politically vanquished, almost as if there had been a military conquest when Trump won. And so when you think about this and you sort of step back for a minute, it's really, really an unhealthy way to organize a society. To have 320 million people under the yoke of basically a few thousand people in Washington, D.C., starting with the president and the administrative agencies, filtering down somewhat to Congress and the Senate, although I would argue they matter less than ever. And then, of course, the Supreme Court, which in many cases just means 5 people, a majority out of 9, making decisions for such a vast country, not only population-wise, but if we look at the diversity of this country, the various economies, if we think about how different Honolulu is from Anchorage, Alaska, or Des Moines, Iowa versus Miami Beach, or an agricultural part of a red state versus a deep blue, part of Manhattan or Brooklyn, it really doesn't make a lot of sense to have a country this big and this diverse governed by such a centralized group of people. And of course, what we're finding out is that when the stakes are this high, when it matters so much who that small group of people is, it's a recipe for social unrest. The blue states and the red states hate each other. They argue about who pays more taxes. They vote for very, very different people. And so, someone who lives, let's say, in a deep blue part of the country has to wake up in the morning and worry about who some deep red part of the country is going to elect to let's say, the U.S. Senate, because that senator is indeed going to have some degree of influence over his or her life. So it really is a situation which I think we need to rethink. And Tom Woods has made this point quite recently, which is that political arrangements exist to serve us, not the other way around. We shouldn't have to comport ourselves to fit whatever sort of political arrangement we have. We ought to be able to change them at will. There's a difference between principles, which we like to think of as unyielding or unchanging, and the manifestation of those in a political arrangement. I think those are two very different things. And I think we ought to be rethinking how we organize the United States politically, and especially, now things have gotten pretty weird in the last few weeks, especially with coronavirus, but if Trump somehow manages to be reelected, I think you're going to see the left in this country go into just an absolutely apoplectic breakdown. I think they're going to be considering all kinds of secession and federalism and subsidiarity and nullification of federal laws in ways that we can't even think of at the moment. So let's look for a second at a little bit of history that I think bolsters the argument for smaller, more localized decision-making. This is the original 13 colonies. In 1790, we had our first U.S. Congress, not our first Continental Congress, but our first U.S. Congress was organized in 1790, coming out of the Revolutionary period. So the entire 13 colonies, what we then called these United States, consisted of about 4 million people. So because there were 13 colonies, they all became states. Each one of them got, obviously, 2 senators under the Constitution, so that was 26 senators. And at the time, at the beginning of that first Congress, there were about 65 U.S. House members. So what that meant was there was about 1 U.S. rep for every 60,000 or so citizens. Now, you fast forward to 2020. Of course, now we had Manifest Destiny, the westward expansion of the United States, the Louisiana Purchase, the United States spreading west, Mexican-American War, et cetera, and go all the way to today, 2020. We've got 327 million people in this country. We only have 435 U.S. House members, so we've maybe multiplied that by about 7 times. We've only doubled the amount of U.S. senators from 26 to 100. So now you take the same math, we've got about 80 times as many people in this country, but we've only got far less of a percentage of new U.S. representatives and senators. So now we have over 700,000 members, 700,000 constituents for every U.S. representative. So we're getting worse and worse when we think of the degree to which we're really represented in our constitutional republic, our democratic form of electing people to the House and to the Senate. If we take the same math, if we say, well, if we do the math on this, we've had an 80% increase, 800%, 80x increase in population. So if you do the math, we should have about 5,200 U.S. House members today if we had simply kept the same per capita representation from colonial times or just post-colonial times. So what that would mean is that unless you lived in a very rural part of the country, you would probably live within a mile or two of your U.S. rep, much like you might currently live within a mile or two of your mayor if you're in a smaller town, or your city council member, or your county council member, or someone like that. I mean, your U.S. rep ought to be someone who you run into at the grocery store, let's say. It ought to be somebody who knows you, and maybe even somebody who fears you a little bit, in the sense that if they go off to Washington and cast some crappy vote with which you strongly disagree, maybe you will bump into them at the grocery store and say, look, Congressman or Congresswoman so-and-so, what the hell are you doing? So I would argue that going from small to big in terms of our percentage per capita representation, especially in the U.S. House, has really taken away from any form of meaningful consent in this country. And the whole purpose behind democracy, ostensibly, and again, going back to the kindergarten view of it, is that, well, democracy gives every man or woman an opportunity to vote. And so as a result, you have the consent of the governed. And that's what gives government legitimacy, is democratic voting and consent of the governed. Well, as the population of this country grows and as proportional representation shrinks, I would argue that that argument becomes more and more attenuated to the point where it's actually pretty silly and pretty ridiculous at this point. I mean, if we look back even on what's considered an enormous landslide national election in this country, 1984 was Ronald Reagan versus Walter Mondale. So Walter Mondale, if I recall, won only his home state of Minnesota. Gosh, I hope I'm correct there. Yes, Walter Mondale, Minnesota, and the District of Columbia. So Ronald Reagan won 49 states. At the time, the population was about 235 million people in the United States. He got about 54 million votes, which obviously not everyone's registered or entitled to vote, minors, et cetera. But nonetheless, he got about 54 million votes out of 235 million people. That was 22% of Americans. 22%, fewer than a quarter of Americans actually voted for Ronald Reagan. And yet that's considered one of the biggest landslides in U.S. national politics. And he was considered to have an absolute victory and a mandate from the people. Okay, so 22% is a mandate from the people. I'm not completely convinced of that. So what do we mean by smaller is better? Well, first of all, I think smaller countries at this point are in many ways doing better than big countries like the United States and China and India, not only in terms of their overall proportional representation in their respective legislatures, but also in terms of happiness and well-being. So this chart shows basically advanced developed nations. We can't just say the West, because obviously there are very developed nations in the Far East, like Japan and South Korea. But among OECD nations, developed nations, this slide shows the number of citizens relative to their number of representatives in their national legislatures. And again, we see the United States at about 750,000 per U.S. rep. And so there's some other countries are not even a quarter, countries like Japan and Mexico. And then when you get down into small countries like Iceland or Belgium or Switzerland, you see much smaller numbers. And so what interests me about this is the idea that we could have much more, first of all, far more U.S. reps, but also that we could push a lot of what's done at the federal level down to either the regional level, the state level, or the local level. There are obviously things which are going to be very tough to unwind, things that make secession and breakaway movements in this country very, very difficult politically and otherwise. Obviously, the history of the South and the Confederacy and the Civil War and slavery are those particular facts, although slavery existed everywhere, those particular facts are particular to the U.S. and our history. So that makes, that pours concrete between the ears of a lot of people when it comes to talking about secession, because they can't get over this mental block of equating secession and states' rights and localism and federalism with the Civil War and the Confederacy and people wanting to enslave Black people. So that's just an unfortunate reality in the United States as part of our history. So that's a tough psychological thing to overcome. But beyond that, there are certainly mechanical and practical arguments against the actual breakup of the United States. That's certainly something I advocate. It's certainly something I favor, but I'm also cognizant of, and I acknowledge some of the problems. The first of which is federal land. There's a lot of federal land all across the country, and not just military bases, but federal land in states like Nevada, which is something 75 or 80% federal. So that's not so easy to divvy up and decide who gets that. Obviously, Social Security and Medicare are federal programs. It's very difficult to do away with those or to cancel those, because there are so many older people, at least in the next 20 to 30 years, who are absolutely depending on those programs to be viable and be in effect, or they would be in very dire circumstances with respect to their health and their income. So those things are not so easy to undo. However, were the United States to break up, that doesn't mean that Social Security and Medicare could not still be administered from Washington, D.C. If you leave the United States right now, and let's say you retire as an expatriate to Panama or to Mexico for a lower cost of living, you can still draw Social Security. You don't have to live in the United States. You can live in a foreign country. Now, Medicare is a little different, because you're going to have a hard time in Mexico or Panama finding a doctor who accepts Medicare. But nonetheless, if you leave the United States, you're still eligible for Medicare benefits. So those things aren't necessarily unsolvable. But the U.S. military, that would be a very difficult thing to unwind, especially not just with regard to the personnel, but also with regard to the arsenal, all the equipment, the tanks, the aircraft carriers, and the nuclear weapons. How would we go about divvying those up if the country were to split up? I think would be very difficult to decide and very fraught. So these are some of the things that we have to think about pragmatically, that we would face in terms of trying to create smaller political entities from the existing United States. But all that said, there's a lot of things we can do within the framework of the existing United States to push decision-making down to the state and local level. And most importantly, I think for our national health and well-being would be to remove some of these social issues from the federal sphere, and especially from the jurisdiction of the U.S. Supreme Court, and push them down to more local decision-making. I mean, why should it be that, let's say, rules about abortion or rules about gun control have to be exactly the same in San Francisco and Manhattan as they are in rural Kansas or rural or Alaskan tundra or deep South Alabama or Mississippi? I mean, it seems to me quite sensible to think that it may be quite a different thing to walk down the street in Manhattan with an AR-15 strapped across your back, as opposed to doing so in some desolate part of Alaska, right? I think we understand this. And so this idea that there's got to be a centralized top-down, one-size-fits-all rule for very difficult social issues like abortion and guns, but also decisions about education, decisions about all kinds of things, I think is a big mistake. And I think it's what's really tearing America apart. So when we look at this chart in front of us about OECD representation, you see Switzerland up there. Let me just throw out an example using Switzerland. Switzerland is about something size-wise, population-wise, something we could compare to, let's say, the San Francisco Bay Area. Switzerland has about 8 million people. The 9 counties, which make up the San Francisco Bay Area, has about 8 million people also. Now, Switzerland is diverse in the sense that it has Roma-speaking people, it has Italian-speaking people, German-speaking people, and French-speaking people. And as a result of this, Switzerland has determined to have its governance as decentralized as possible. And what's so fascinating about Switzerland and its model is that if you go to the Swiss website, which is of course excellent and available in multiple languages seamlessly, you will see there that subsidiarity and federalism are actually principles woven into the Swiss constitution. And so Switzerland openly endeavors to push as many decisions as possible down to the state level. The states in Switzerland are called cantons. There's 26 of them. But even better than that, they try to push decisions down to the communal level. There's cities in Switzerland that are called communes. And of course, there are many hundreds or thousands of communes across Switzerland. And what I find fascinating about the Swiss model is they even say on their own website that the idea behind the Swiss principle of subsidiarity is social cohesion. We want decisions to be made as locally as possible. And so the only things that the Swiss government really attempts to do at the national level are run its currency, which is the Swiss National Bank is in charge of the Swiss franc. And then, of course, the Swiss military is, in fact, federal. So national defense is centralized and federalized in Switzerland. But the point here is that the president of Switzerland matters very, very little. In fact, the Swiss Federal Council has something like 8 members, and they all rotate being president for a year. So nobody can name the president of Switzerland outside of the Swiss themselves. And a lot of the Swiss themselves can't name the president of Switzerland because it just doesn't much matter. It's not a very important position. What's far more important in Switzerland is who is in charge at your communal level, your city level, or your cantonal level, your state level. So what happens in Switzerland is about 80% of your taxes go to your commune or your canton. Only about 20% go to the Swiss national federal government. So in the United States, that's about flipped. Most of us send about 80% to Washington, D.C., and maybe 20% to our state governments. And so Washington, D.C. skims a huge portion of that off the top to pay for its own bureaucracy, and then spends the rest of it badly and sort of redistributes it back to us in the form of all kinds of things like federal highway funds. So it seems to me that the Swiss do this a lot better. And I just wonder, as a thought experiment, let's take those aforementioned 9 counties in the San Francisco Bay Area. Now, those 9 counties run very, very blue. They tend to vote overwhelmingly Democrat, and not just Democrat, but on the left side of Democrat. They're very pro-Nancy Pelosi. She's returned to Congress year after year from her home district in the city of San Francisco. Those 9 counties voted against the recall of Gray Davis, which installed Arnold Schwarzenegger as governor. The vast majority of the people in those 9 counties would be more for Bernie, let's say, than they would be for Joe Biden, and certainly anti-Trump. So outside of those 9 counties and 8 million people, which is as big as Switzerland, bigger than Norway, bigger than Finland, bigger than some European countries which operate independently, would the rest of us in this country really much care if those 9 counties in the San Francisco Bay Area instituted far more of their own local decision-making? Would we much care if those 9 counties said, we're going to have free health care. We're going to have single-payer health care. We're going to implement a tax amongst everyone in these counties and start having free single-payer health care. We're going to have free education. We are going to make Stanford and Berkeley, which are in those counties, we're going to make Stanford and Berkeley free to anyone who can get in. We're going to have very progressive income tax rates, up to 90 or 95% on high earners. We're going to have a wealth tax on people's net worth to deal with income and wealth inequality. We are going to permit abortion. Screw the Supreme Court and what they say. Screw what Alabama says. We are, within these 9 counties, we're going to permit abortion right up until delivery. because we feel very strongly in a woman's right to choose. Screw what the Supreme Court says, screw what Alabama says. We are going to basically ban firearms within these 9 counties. They're going to be illegal. It's going to be a criminal act to possess them. Maybe we'll have a small degree of long rifle ownership like they have at gun clubs in the UK and in France, for example. But, you know, your garden variety handgun that a bad guy is using in a stick up at a liquor store, those are going to be just completely banned. And if you get caught with one, you're going to be in big trouble. We are going to have hate crime laws. We are going to criminally punish people who say bad things about minorities or LGBT people, whatever it might be. In other words, within those 9 counties, we are going to implement right here, right now, the entire panoply of progressive wish list items. Okay? Now, there are some people within those 9 counties who are, let's say, conservative in their political view or more libertarian-minded, who would indeed be made worse off. There would be a group of people who are worse off and for whom these changes would be unfair or unwelcome. But it's a lot easier to leave the San Francisco Bay Area than it is to leave your country. You don't need a passport to move out of the Bay Area into Riverside, California, or into Incline Village, Nevada, or into Portland, Oregon, or whatever it might be. So the idea that you could vote with your feet is more meaningful and more realistic when we're talking about a much smaller political subdivision like what we would now call the San Francisco Bay Area. So, you know, I don't agree with that entire progressive wish list of policies by any stretch. In fact, I probably strongly disagree with virtually all of it. But would I mind? Would I protest? Well, no, of course I wouldn't. As a matter of fact, I would wish the San Francisco Bay Area well. And I would say, look, maybe with the social cohesion you'd enjoy, and maybe everyone would just give up some of their discretionary income to pay into the single-payer healthcare fund. Maybe people would say, hey, I'm not going to have as fancy of a car. Maybe I'm not going to take that European vacation this year, or whatever it might be. You know, they'd have means testing and apply a greater degree of tax to people who may have more money. And so I'm going to have a little bit, a little bit lower standard of living. I'm going to have a little bit less stuff, maybe a little bit less fun in my life. I'm not going to go out to eat as much, but as a result, we're going to have a single payer healthcare system. And the poorest among us are not going to have to worry about lacking health insurance. So no one is going to go bankrupt or go without care if they have cancer or if they're in a bad car accident or whatever it might be. Okay? So, you know, I would argue as a libertarian that that's not going to work, that people would quickly move out of the Bay Area when they're forced to pay for it. They would create bad incentives because people would overuse so-called free medicine, and that you'd end up with too few payers and too many takers, and that, you know, just like public choice theory explains, you know, we could say that all the incentives would be wrong, and that we'd end up with wait lists and shortages and yada yada, and all the inefficiencies that we as libertarians would ascribe to a truly single-payer centralized medical system. But okay, maybe I'm wrong. I mean, prove me wrong. On a small scale, maybe the San Francisco Bay Area would create quite a decent little single-payer healthcare system. I don't know. It's certainly not my place to say they can't do it because of Washington, D.C., 3,000 miles away. So this is just an example of how I see a more decentralized U.S., you know, applying the principles of subsidiarity, creating at least experiments for different parts of the country, if not better outcomes. And by the same token, if people in Alabama, I happen to live in Auburn, Alabama, which is a nice little college town, about 75,000 people. It's kind of a blue area within a red state, but nonetheless, if the good people of Alabama say, you know, screw DC, screw the Supreme Court, we're going to have prayer before high school football games or whatever, you know, and we dare you to send in the federales or something. Are people in San Francisco really going to care that much that what they perceive as a bunch of hick redneck Bible thumpers in Alabama are praying before football game? No, I think they would say that's fine as long as we're not required to. So, you know, the idea of thinking about how Switzerland does things and maybe applying that idea of subsidiarity to the United States is really one that fascinates me. And I got to tell you, I'd love to see some movement in this direction sooner rather than later, because you don't have to go to the dark corners of the internet to hear people talking openly about the possibility of civil war in this country. Now, maybe 10 years ago, talk about secession and civil war and the U.S. breaking up was kind of in the corners of the internet. But after the Trump election, I mean, you can find this stuff in very mainstream publications, neoconservative outlets like the Claremont Review. Now, Claremont tends to be very pro-Lincoln. It tends to be neoconservative in its foreign policy outlook. But nonetheless, there are very sober people there, like Angelo Codevilla, who wrote an article called The Cold Civil War in the Claremont Review of Books. You can Google it, and it's in the free part of their site. They're a subscription site. But The Cold Civil War by Angelo Codevilla, you know, really gives a very eye-opening perspective on what a breakup of the U.S. might look from the right-wing perspective. From the left side, the New Republic, which is a pretty down-the-middle left progressive publication, not wild-eyed. Not long after Trump won, there was an article called Blue Exit, as in blue states exiting, Blue Exit, by a gentleman named Baker, that basically said, you know, it's time for us blue states to turn our backs on these retrograde racist red states and start thinking about how we can operate independent of them, and how we can unyoke ourselves and decouple ourselves politically from those red states. So you can see this on both sides. And I absolutely believe that a greater degree of federalism and subsidiarity in this country would result in far better outcomes for most people. I think it would be far more peaceable way for us to organize such a vast group of people, 320 million people. I think it would be far more humane. I think from a libertarian perspective, it would give us the opportunity to compete, to have what really would be a laboratory of competing systems close by, even if that took a more drastic turn to actual literal secession, political secession, where we had a breakup of the United States. There's no reason to believe that we couldn't have very free trade and travel between those former one country, those new regions formerly part of one country. There's no reason why we would all of a sudden expect very rigid, tariff wars or travel restrictions between those countries. I think it could be worked out quite peaceably. And I'll leave you with this. A couple of years ago, Nassim Taleb, who is the author of Anti-Fragile and The Black Swan. I'm sure a lot of you know him as a very interesting thinker about probability and statistics. Nassim Taleb had a tweet that I really liked. And he said, I'm paraphrasing him, he said, I am a libertarian at the federal level, a Republican at the state level, a Democrat at the local level, and a socialist at the family level. And I thought there was a lot of wisdom in that tweet. And more, I'm finding myself thinking the same way, that what might be the question, the political question of the 21st century is not ideology, not socialism versus capitalism, not individualism versus collectivism, but instead the level at which we're governed, because it all goes back to the same question of who decides. And libertarians have been asking that question for a long time. Who decides? Well, who decides depends a lot on where who is deciding. So the where matters as much as the who. So with that, I want to thank you very much for inviting me and open this up.
Sorry about that. I had myself on mute for a minute there, just not to interrupt you there, but that was really very good. In terms of, acting on any of this, what would be something we could start to do individually or like in our local communities to try to push this thought process a little further along?
Well, I think we can all do things locally that matter. Look, I'm the last, I'm the farthest guy in the world from the student council type, or, that's the Tracy Flicks of the world for people who've seen the movie Election. But nonetheless, I actually did go to a meeting about my neighborhood recently that's dealing with a really bad intersection where there's been some accidents, including a really nasty car flipped over recently, and there was a mom and a young kid in it. And so this intersection deserves some kind of flashing light or roundabout or whatever it's going to be. So I actually did go to that. You know, that's the kind of thing where maybe little old me could have some influence. I've also recently become involved in a prison reform effort in the state of Alabama, where I live. Alabama, like a lot of other southern states, actually is among the least annual per capita spending per inmate. And something I found out not too long ago that makes me very unhappy is that prisons in Alabama do not have air conditioning, state prisons. And as you know, Alabama gets very hot and humid in the summer, so I consider this inhumane. I consider this a form of an extra form of punishment beyond just the sentence which one is given. And so I'm working with a state senator down here named Cam Ward, who has sort of a task force comprised of legislators and also civilians. And you know, you can, you know, you might think I'm crazy as a libertarian, but if more of my taxes went to providing air conditioning for prisons, honestly, I think that you know, providing humane treatment for prisoners is going to ultimately benefit me, because people are going to leave those prisons, and I don't want them coming out of there worse than they went in or more angry than they went in. So you know, I don't have any great answers here. Those are just a couple of things that I'm working on locally. But more importantly, I think, is to be thinking about how the future of entitlements in this country, Social Security and Medicare, and the huge gaps between what we're likely to take in tax revenue and what we promised older people in the future, it means that whether we like it or not, the federal government's not going to be able to live up to its promises. It's just that simple. It's not going to be able to provide Social Security and Medicare and all this defense spending forever and ever, and pay people their benefits, at least pay them in any meaningful term. Maybe they can be paid nominally, but inflation adjusted, that, you know, their Social Security payments will become very small. So whether we like it or not, the federal government's not going to be able to do what it says it's going to do, and that's in the very near future, the next few decades. So to the extent we can be thinking more locally, we all know that we spend our own money more carefully than we spend other people's money. So if we apply that even to taxes, I mean, every step of government that's farther away from those taxes you pay reduces the care with which they're spent. And so I think that has to be our focus, because, you know, I don't want to beat up 70 million progressives in this country. I don't want to club them over the head with my libertarian ideology and say, you know, you guys better start reading Rothbard and Hoppe. You guys are evil. You're wrong. Look at Stalin. Look at Pol Pot. Look at Hitler. That's where collectivism leads. You guys are evil, and I need to vanquish you politically. You know, first of all, I'm acutely aware of holding an exceedingly minority political view, which for me personally is anarcho-capitalism. But even if I was a, you know, garden variety Republican or something, I think things are just getting to the point in this country where we have to think about that old adage: a man convinced against his will is of the same opinion still, and start thinking about how we can mobilize instead of always thinking we have to persuade.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's such a commonsensical and realistic realization. And the fact that it really comes down to everybody kind of managing for themselves and locally to help their local community. It's like the classic person while driving in our own little cocoon in our car, but a car flips over and everyone pulls over and jumps out to help that person. So we're still that community, but sadly, it's still going to take a political something to make something change. We just can't volunteer our way out of what you just described, that infrastructure that's inextricably bound us together. Where can we push on that envelope to make anything happen? I mean, it's going to be hard to run that right-minded candidate because they're going to get no votes or whatever. What do we do? Well,
it might happen regardless of what we do, because the federal government starts to sputter.
Yeah, that part's true. Then we better be ready in the background with all that local stuff in play.
Sure, and I think states will just have to take over federal highways. There are sections thereof. All kinds of things will happen. And I guess the best we can hope for is that it occurs slowly so that we can adjust without some sort of crisis. And I certainly hope that what's going on in the stock markets and what's going on with coronavirus does not turn into a crisis. You know, it's the last thing we wish for because we don't want harm to other people. But more importantly, if you look at history, crises usually don't yield libertarian outcomes. They usually yield authoritarian outcomes.
Right.
And so, you know, anything we can do now is better than anything we do when we're up against it.
Got it. David, I see you've got your hand up.
Jeff, I'd like to bounce 3 ideas off of you as possible means to move towards sanctuary counties and cities in the legal sense that you've described. One is going towards private ownership of public goods, and another is jury nullification, and a third one would be even the coronavirus as an opportunity for private citizens to take the bull by the horns and getting us moving in the direction of localization. Your thoughts on those 3?
Well, let's start with the coronavirus. You know, we're all so conditioned to look to government, and especially federal government, for our cues on how to act. I mean, you know, if you're a private resort, there was nothing stopping you a month ago from closing your doors and sending your staff home and saying, you know, we're worried about the coronavirus, so we're going to take immediate proactive steps here on our private property, which as libertarians, we like to think of as sort of a panacea. You know, private property solves X, Y, and Z. And in some ways it does. Now, that resort may not have done that because, first of all, they didn't have enough information. They were relying on WHO or CDC or federal government. It may be because it's not so easy to close your doors. You're relying on the income you have you obtained from having those doors open. It could be a lot of things. But as I mentioned earlier, you know, ultimately what happens to each of us with coronavirus is going to be awfully local. And so maybe after this, communities will do a better job of, you know, thinking ahead about infectious disease. But it's a tough, look, I wish I had a better answer because a lot of the funding they get for that preparation comes from Uncle Sam. You know, they got to apply for grants and everything. But, you know, if coronavirus becomes a big deal, I think people are going to become more communitarian as a result. So maybe that's a silver lining. And, you know, when it comes to people, when it comes to private ownership of what we think of as public resources or public goods, I'm all for it. Obviously, privatization of whole cities would be a wonderful thing, but certainly roads, certainly schools, those sorts of things, because, you know, it's not just about the misallocation of resources when it comes to government control of production. It's not just about the inefficiencies inherent in government. It's not just about the lack of profit motive and profit or loss signals. It's also about skin in the game. Nobody has more skin in the game right now than, let's say, Delta Airlines when it comes to coronavirus. Those are their planes. Those are their pilots. That's the fuel they've paid for. And if nobody flies this summer, Delta's going to have a real tough time and their stock's going to tank. Now, they happen to operate in a heavily regulated industry, but even so, you know, apart from everything else, you know, nobody in government is spending their own money. And that, at the end of the day, nobody in government is getting sued personally. Nobody in government is losing, you know, stock value personally when people lose faith in FedGov or when FedGov screws up. When Delta screws up, even when it's something beyond their control like coronavirus, they pay. And so that's the difference. And that makes all the difference in the world. That's what makes people proactive. That's what gives them foresight. That's what makes them buy insurance. That's what makes them plan and do all kinds of things that make us better off when something does happen. So, you know, I hope we can learn lessons from this, and you know, but more than anything, I hope it just turns into. I hope it doesn't spread much more, and I hope it turns into something that doesn't kill people.
Charles, we've got time for one last question there.
Thanks, Jeff and Jeff. You know, there is a presidential candidate, Adam Kokesh, who has made localism his big theme, but, you know, given his lack of name ID and attention, there's not much chance of that theme going beyond his campaign. broadening kind of your presentation here from just the localism, idealism, which would be great. And we're closing up here on this event. Tell us a bit more about the Mises Institute in terms of events that are coming up during the year that people can learn about and attend and get more involved with your think tank.
Well, we may be having fewer events than we thought at this rate.
True.
I'm not sure. Well, our events might be webinars like this one. Real briefly on Kokesh, I don't know him, but I have met him once a couple years ago. I really like him. Just seems like a genuine guy. He seems to me like a natural person. That's what I love about Kokesh. Is I know Jacob Hornberger a lot better. Of course, I love Jacob. So I don't know which one of those guys. I guess I don't really have a rooting interest. I'm not much of a voter, but I really hope one of them makes a splash anyway. Mises Institute, we're trying to be an end run around academia. We're trying to be an alt school, the alternative school that you never had, because either in high school and college, either you had no economics, which is very possible, or you had what we would consider bad economics or wrong economics. And so we're just here to be a resource. We want everything we offer, whether it's through our website or whatever, to be basically free, to be downloadable, to be instantaneous, because a lot of Americans suffer under not just illiteracy and innumeracy, but also under a real lack of knowledge of economics. If you don't understand economics, it leaves you awfully susceptible to political promises and to pundits and to fake economists like Paul Krugman or Noah Smith. And so, if you just want to consume a little bit of economic education by following us on Twitter, let's say, and every once in a while reading an article, or if you want to consume a whole bunch of economics education, read 900-page books, we want to be here for both those people and everybody in between, and hopefully along the way, not just open people's minds about what we would consider real or sound economics, but also make a better case for a liberal society.
And I'll plug your scholar, Patrick Newman, who last week presented that lost, now found volume Rothbard wrote on our America founding. That was a great presentation, and I can't wait to get that book from your Mises Institute.
Well, it's great to talk to you after so many years, Charlie.
Excellent. Jeff Kander?
Sorry there, I muted once again. I'd like to definitely thank you for spending some time with us today. That was really great. And it's good to see, little by little, all this is happening in the background. So it will prevail in the end. It's just the incrementalism and just like the river grinding that rock away. Like you said, there's more of us all the time. I've been at Freedom Fest, see people like this from all over the world. So very encouraging in spite of all of what else seems to be in the news all the time. Absolutely. If we can just survive this virus, we'll be golden.
I agree.
Very good. Thanks again.
Okay. Thank you.